All right, we're officially recording, I guess. So maybe we should introduce ourselves first. Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, my name's Krivo Flores. I'm double majoring in philosophy and linguistics at Portland State University. I'm also minoring in psychology. And yeah, I try to specialize in the philosophy of language and cognitive science, especially embodied cognition and that whole general area of inquiry.
Cool. My name's Jonathan Lang, and I am a dissertator in the philosophy department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'll be finishing up this year, hopefully. Um, and I, too, study cognitive science. I don't do exactly the same kind of stuff that you do with cognitive science and linguistics, but I do study a lot of language stuff. And my dissertation, it turns out, is on embodied cognition. So it turns
Nice.
out that this is a really nice pairing, I think. So
Agreed. Very much looking forward to it.
what did you say?
I said agreed and very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, great. So do you want to start off by talking to the audience about your paper just a little bit, giving them a rough outline of your central thesis?
Sure, sure. Well, so the paper's titled Human Linguistics, Hume's Theory of Meaning and the Origins of Embodied Cognitive Science. In this paper, I think it won't make much sense without being put into context. And that context is it's a direct response and inspired by Chomsky's book, Cartesian Linguistics. And so it's interesting that this paper came about in a fit of inspiration. I was reading Cartesian Linguistics and Jerry Fodor's Hume Variations around the same time, and was enjoying but also a little annoyed by both books. And shortly thereafter, I had read this book by a linguist, cognitive linguist, Benjamin Bergen from UC Berkeley. He was a student of George Lakoff's. It was a book called Louder Than Words, The New Science of How the Mind Makes Meaning. And it's all about embodied cognition and language. And while I was reading that book, I just kept thinking of Hume, and suddenly it just hit me like a lightning bolt, this idea to write a response. Seriously, the paper just kind of wrote itself in my mind in one big flash, this whole confluence of Cartesian linguistics with Jerry Fodor's take on Hume, and then this embodied cognitive approach to linguistics. And yeah, it just hit me really, really fast. And I couldn't stop thinking while I was reading Bergen's book that it was so Humean. Like the theses, the research, and everything, I just couldn't help think of Hume. But so the way that this actual paper came about, though, is I had joined the Hume Society, and it's the International Hume Society, and I saw they had a call for papers. And immediately I thought to write this paper and submit it. So I wrote it up and showed it to Dr. Coventry, who just got back from sabbatical. She's a Hume scholar. At that time, she was the vice president of the Hume Society. And I told her I wanted to submit a paper. They were doing a call for papers on Hume and language. And so I thought, this would be a great topic. And she liked the paper, but she said it needed to be more scholarly, more, in particular, more focused on Hume and less on cognitive science. And so she assisted me in writing a paper that I did submit to that conference. But it turns out my other advisor, Dr. Avram Hiller, who I think you know, wanted me to submit another paper I'd written to this conference we're talking in now. But I ended up already getting that paper accepted to the Pacific University Conference. And so this is the only other paper I had. So I submitted it to you guys, and it got in by surprise. So that's a long way of kind of putting it in context. So it's only makes sense as a response to Cartesian linguistics. But my central thesis, I guess I would say, I could put it in an if-then statement, is that if this whole computational nativist kind of abstract formal approach to language pushed by Chomsky and Fodor warrants the designation Cartesian linguistics, then I contend that this embodied account based on habit, simulation, ideas, imagery, likewise warrants the designation Humean linguistics. And so it's kind of a yin-yang there. And so I think that's a rough characterization.
Mhm.
Unpack it as we go. Nope, I can't hear you.
Yeah, yeah. So let's start to unpack it just a little bit. So why don't you say a little bit more about? I said let's go ahead and try to start to unpack that thesis a little bit. Um, Maybe you could say something about what you think human linguistics actually it is because you've coined this phrase, right? This is like a neologism
Yes.
attributed to you.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us just a little bit about what exactly human linguistics is?
Okay, so what I envision human linguistics to be, so basically, Hume starts everything with perception. Like the only object that really exists for Hume are perceptions, and he divides perceptions this into two: impressions and ideas. Impressions being what he calls the livelier things and actually feeling or perceiving objects. What we could carefully say, like veridical perception, like a positive would say, is actually feeling or seeing. And then the ideas are fainter copies than those when we reflect, think, have imagery. Obviously, I'm being very rough here. So this idea is the Hume's copy principle, which states that any impression, either of the mind, body, it can be through any more modality, has a corresponding idea, which in the case of simple ideas exactly represents those simple impressions. So each simple impression corresponds to a simple idea. As it turns out, this new, well, relatively new thesis, the embodied simulation hypothesis in cognitive linguistics, says very much the same thing in cognitive neuroscientific terms, that the way we understand language is by simulating in our minds the types of experiences the language describes. So to unpack that, a rough characterization of the theory is when we understand language about, for example, visible phenomenon, colors, objects, shapes, we employ the same parts of our brain used to actually perceive those objects. Likewise, for motor representations, haptic perception, auditory perception, the idea is that the way we understand language is by using the parts of our brain that we would use were we to actually experience those types of reference in the real world. And so that's the base of it. So what I see is this embodied simulation hypothesis is cashing out Hume's copy principle in terms of modern day cognitive neuroscience. Yeah, and there's a lot of examples, so I'm sure we'll get into, but that's the basic idea. So Humean linguistics, rather than being based on abstract formal syntax or kind of formal semantic computational ideas, is more directly related to perception and particularly ideas we might call neural reuse or acceptation. And so Hume, right away in his treatise, says perhaps that one principle of the mind depends on another, and maybe those can be resolved into a more general theory, which very much unlike Chomskyan or Fodorian modularity thesis, where language is kind of this independent thinking thing, that's the source of our reason, this very separate faculty, which Chomsky would say probably just popped in, at some point, almost fully formed in evolutionary time. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good start. But so that's the basis of it.
Okay, great. So a lot of my main questions about the paper have to do with the nature of human linguistics and how it's actually different from the embodied simulation hypothesis. And I also am kind of interested in how ambitious you are with regard to what you think human linguistics can provide us over and above just the embodied simulation hypothesis, right? Because,
yeah.
One thing that you could be doing in this paper is saying, look, Hume had the idea first, kind of, right? I mean, there's people working on the embodied simulation hypothesis now, but really what we should be doing is tipping our hats to Hume because, the groundwork there was done by Hume, hundreds of years ago or something like that. Or you could be saying something like, philosophers, cognitive scientists nowadays are actually influenced by Hume and they pull from Hume's account to inform their own accounts or something like that. But I sort of suspect that you're not saying the latter thing. You're just sort of making the former claim, right?
Yeah, I'm definitely making the former claim that, that what you said. Though I would go a little farther. in that I think human linguistics extends beyond the embodied simulation hypothesis. I think that just like I would put it analogously that so Hume's theory of ideas, based on the copy principle, association of ideas, is the foundation of his whole approach. But it's not. It doesn't constitute his whole. It's just kind of where he starts. And I think what I envision for what I call human linguistics starts with embodied simulation, but does not end there. It's just where it begins. But in regards to your question, the former rather than the latter.
Yeah. So okay. So so Hume kind of had the idea first, and that's an interesting kind of historical claim. I mean, authors who write on embodied cognition are very interested in tracing the intellectual history of embodied cognition, right? So we get the same sort of names that come up over and over again in the literature. So people will say, look, embodied cognition in a way comes out of the phenomenology of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty or something like that. Or if you're doing something like perceptual psychology, you want to say that J.J. Gibson is this big progenitor of embodied cognition. Or if you're doing stuff maybe on evolution, you'll talk about what's that guy's name? Uxkol, yeah, and Umwelt and all this stuff. There's lots of names that are thrown into there and saying that look, these people are precursors, and you want to add a new name to that list. You want to say, well, actually, Hume predates all of these other people, right? He is really like the founding father of embodied cognition. But there's a couple things to say about that. I think one is, do you really think that Hume is the founding father of embodied cognition, or do you think that Hume is just, an empiricist, and in that sense, he's kind of the founding father of cognition because he's the first one to say, well, he's not actually the first one, but he's one of the first people to start saying, look, our concepts that we have, our ideas that we have, come to us from interactions with the environment, from the world impinging upon our sensory organs or whatever. And so, in that sense, I guess, you can say he is a founding father of embodied cognition because he says that the world affects us in a particular way and outfits us with, certain concepts that aren't innately built into us or whatever. But do you think that that's enough to say, look, he is sort of like the founder of embodied cognition? Because that's a really bold claim, right?
Well, no, I don't think what you just said is enough, but I do think there are additional things that single out Hume as more of a progenitor. Before a few other things though to put it in context. So a lot of this is a response to, I don't know if you've read Hume Variations by Fodor, where so the whole book is his attempt to claim Hume as the founder of his version of cognitive science. And so he spends a lot of the time in the book dispensing with Hume's imagism and associationism and saying basically that Hume had things right, except he should have been a Cartesian representationalist. So part of my motivation is kind of saying, okay, Fodor, well, here's my take. And because Fodor is kind of one of the avatars of traditional symbolic cognitive science as opposed to this more embodied thing. So that's part of it. The other side of that is that I find a lot of people just in straight-up linguistics are a little naive with the philosophy that came before, and this maybe it's just Bergen and the department here, but I've been surprised, and so part of my motivation is to alert the people that don't have philosophical training about this whole wide tradition. Especially Hume, that has basically I see them as corroborating in their own work, and it's not just for historical reasons of scholarship, but I think it can actually be a guide to future discovery. So if Hume was basically tracking these same lines of inquiry without the methods of modern science, like I said, he just began with this embodied simulation copy principle idea, but then he takes it farther, and so people who were trying to extend, let's say, the embodied simulation to account for abstract ideas and other socially public meanings could do well to look at Hume. So that's the first part. The second part is that
So wait. So to do well, it would do them well to look at Hume.
Well, to look at his further ideas that extend beyond just his copy principle.
So do you think? I mean, so here's another question I have. Do you think that the stuff that Hume was doing can be utilized now to further projects in embodied cognition, or do you think that it's just part of the intellectual history of embodied cognition? We should recognize Hume as the first one to talk about this stuff, or do you think, look, if we really pay close attention to what Hume says, we'll get some more insight into this, insight that we don't have already.
No, I do think, that we'll have insight that we don't have already. I do think there's a benefit to just kind of giving credit where credit's due.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But yeah, I do think Hume's work can actually inform current work. So a few things. I think Hume deserves this designation beyond just general empiricism for a few reasons. Well, for instance, Berkeley, is obviously an idealist. That's problematic. Locke, whether fairly or unfairly, is kind of associated with this blank tabula rasa conception of mind. But what I really think makes Hume stand apart, his explicit statement about one principle of the mind being dependent on the other, which to me ties into this idea that our perceptual system and linguistic system kind of all use the same parts. These ideas of neural reuse, or what we call in evolutionary psychology exaptation. Hume was one of the first, I don't know, maybe one of the first to kind of say, well, maybe the mind kind of reuses its parts. And his quote is that, one operation of the mind likely depends on the other, or on some general principle like that. Second of all, it's interesting, I struggled with whether just calling it embodied cognition in this paper, or something more like grounded, ecological cognition. And so there's kind of what I call a terminological metastasis going on in this whole realm of embodied cognition. We got embodied cognition, ecological cognition, embedded cognition, inactivism, grounded, situated. What was it? Yeah, and there's just a lot of or extended mind and all this stuff. So it was really hard to pick one. I think we need to bust out Occam's eraser and kind of narrow it down. So I would say, but the one I think applies most broadly to Hume is the idea of grounded. Just the cognition must be grounded in some fashion. And I think, I would say Hume agrees with us too. It's not just bodily states, or maybe even primarily bodily states. But Hume in particular, via his skepticism, kind of showed the limits of reason, that at some level our rational capacity has to bottom out in something more like habit. He even said mechanical. We can't leave, nature didn't leave all these important things up to our rational faculty. It just kind of, at some point, habit and nature takes over. And to me, that's a very stark contrast to something like this rational model of, this pure symbolic computation, which is basically just pure reason, cranking away over abstract symbols. It's very rational to the bottom. And Hume, I think, was one of the first, if not the first, to show the limits of reason. And that's why I think his work ties into the importance of a grounding for cognition.
Well, here's something, I think there are people before Hume that pointed to the limits of reason more generally. I mean, lots of people. Locke, for instance, thought there were a lot of constraints on what we could come to know. But let's talk about Locke for a second, because I think that Locke makes a lot of points similar to Hume, and maybe, and this is sort of like positive advice for your paper, maybe if you clean this up and you want to send it out someplace, you might want to cast your net a little bit wider than just Hume, and maybe look at Locke, because let's see, Hume's inquiry was written like 1748 or something like that, and something. And Locke's essay concerning human understanding was written in like 1690 or something like that. So long before the inquiry. But Locke says a lot of similar things to Hume that might be relevant here. For instance, when Locke is addressing the Descartesian skeptic in the essay concerning a human understanding, he has this. He makes these like copy principle type points, right? He'll say things like, "Look, there's a definite difference between how vivid our phenomenological experiences are when we're looking at objects out in the world versus how vivid they are when we're just recalling them or imagining them or something like that." And it sounds very Humean. He talks about this in book 4 in chapter 2. So he seems to be making quite similar points there. And you might want to say that. Oh, hold on, just a second. Sorry about that. Yeah, you might want to say that. Look, isn't Locke kind of even more so the father of embodied cognition or something like that, more so than Hume, because Locke is got the empiricism, right? He thinks that that our ideas are grounded by experiences, right? He's got kind of a cognitive linguistics type thing going on, right? Just like Hume does. But he also says, look, our actual perceptions are quite different from when we just tap into our ideas through memory or whatever. You could say, look, this maps on quite nicely to Bergen's simulation hypothesis, embodied simulation hypothesis, right? Maybe Locke is the founder of embodied cognition in that sense, and not just Hume. So do you think that there's something that Hume really has going for him that Locke doesn't, where we'd say, look, Hume, he's the man, he's the founder of embodied cognition. Locke, not so much.
Yes, but I also think we got to give credit where credit's due. I mean, yeah, a lot of these ideas did originate with Locke. In particular, I think, so in the paper that I did end up submitting to the Hume conference, another paper called Reconsidering Hume's Philosophy of Language, I did go into Locke. I also reviewed a paper by Walter Ott called Hume on Meaning, and he talks a lot about Locke there. So I do think we need to give Locke credit, but there are some things that I think bump Hume up in front of that. The one that springs to mind right away is the abstract ideas, which of course he pinched from Berkeley. So it's interesting, a lot of people who have mocked Hume's philosophy of language, and Locke's too, but basically accuse Hume of kind of just importing Locke's theory of language wholesale, which I think there's something to that, but I think he did tweak it in some really nice ways. One way is that by siding with Berkeley on the account of abstract ideas, which will tie into how we want to get from embodied simulation to more abstract language. I think that's something that Hume dealt with in a way. But yeah, it's tough. It's like, so if I'm going to write this paper, I want to, answer Chomsky with his Cartesian linguistic. Well, who's my avatar? And it could have been Locke or Berkeley, but my contention is Hume won, and mainly is that he took the best of Berkeley, the best of Locke, and put his own spin on it, but also added this, the skepticism showing the limits of reason, the dependence of one principle of the mind on another. But in my opinion, the most important comes later with his account of convention and habit and kind of publicly available meanings, which Berkeley touched on for sure a little bit too. But Berkeley's got problems. He's got the idealist problem. Though I think Berkeley, man, I just read his account of abstract ideas again recently, and I don't know. Props to Berkeley there. But yeah, so those are why, for me, Hume is the guy rather than Locke or Berkeley. And there's some contemporary folks, but they both credit Hume. So, for example, Bertrand Russell in The Analysis of Mind and an Inquiry into Meaning and Understanding, he develops a Humean account. Also, a guy I've been really reading a lot of is H.H. Price in Thinking and Experience. And likewise, it's very, very Humean. So,
Mhm.
so I'm sticking with Hume.
Sticking with Hume. All right, that sounds good. But yeah, that seems like a good avenue to go down then if you're going to expand the paper, right? Is to look more generally at the empiricists and maybe focus a little bit more on Locke and at least how Locke is different from Hume so that you can actually say, you know, definitely, for sure, Hume, Hume's the
Yeah.
guy. Not just because everybody cites Hume, but for reasons more than that. You talked about abstract ideas a little bit, and I know that you don't set out to defend the embodied simulation hypothesis in this paper in particular. I mean, you're mostly interested in crediting Hume as the founder of embodied cognition. But you know, might be fun to talk a little bit about abstract ideas in the context of the embodied simulation hypothesis, because you know, when I was first reading this, I was thinking, you know, oh, this makes sense. I know some of this stuff on, you know, the perceptual symbol system hypothesis, some of the literature by Barcelou, for instance, um, and you know how people attempt to ground the meanings of sentences in, you know, um, you know, via some perceptual faculty or activation in the brain in the perceptual areas. Um, but it seems to me like there's a kind of scaling up problem, the
Mhm.
up being to more abstract sentences, right? So if you're thinking about deploying a concept like hammer, for instance, you might think, okay, well, I can tap into my motor plan for how to use a hammer, and that constitutes part of the meaning of the term hammer, right? But what about, you know, the meaning of more abstract sentences? What about the meaning of sentences where, you know, you've never observed the thing necessarily that you're talking about, right? Let's say by talking about hammer, I sort of know what a hammer does because I've talked to other people about hammers, but I've never actually used one myself or seen one used or something like that. Um, you know, how do you think this kind of account will sort of scale up to give us the meaning of abstract sentences on the one hand, and maybe, you know, non-observed, or sentences about non-observed things, right?
Well, that's the problem, right? So the big one of the big challenges for the embodied conception of language, the whether it be, you know, the perceptual symbols or Glenberg's indexical hypothesis or Kurgan's you know, characterization of this is how do we deal with abstract language? And there's a few ways. And I love this topic, by the way, so I'm happy to talk about it. I do want to dance a little bit back and forth between what I think how Hume would deal with the problem and then how modern cognitive science is dealing with the problem. And I think there's a relation, but there. So first, like Hume talks about having an idea of New Jerusalem. He's never been to New Jerusalem, but he's like, so how can that term be meaningful to me? And his explanation is that via the copy principle, the principle of the association of ideas and the imagination constructs out of simple impressions, his ideas of cities, what he's heard from conversations about this city, to construct kind of a hypothetical or, you know, semi-fictitious example of what he thinks that city would be like, which constitutes his understanding. So that's the basis of a Hume account. So with now back to modern day cognitive science. So there's a traditional answer to how can a cognitive empiricist account deal with abstract language, and I bet you know what it is. It's metaphor and analogy. So like the leading theory for a while was that we conceptualize more abstract domains via reference or to more concrete embodied domains. So for example, we conceptualize time in terms of space and have these basic image schemas like up is more and down is less and warm is good, you know, or love is a journey is the one that everybody picks on Lakoff for, which, you know, I can kind of sympathize with. I do think there's some truth there, but it's not going to get you as far as I want to get. I don't think it's going to get you all the way up to things like, you know, infinite sets and you know, the axioms of group theory or whatever, you know, or something like the angst of post-industrial man and late capitalism or something like that. So let me think. Um, yeah, so uh, abstract ideas. So my current favorite proposals come from Andy Clark,
Hmm.
uh, famous wrote The Extended Mind. And there's a recent paper this year out by Anna M. Borghi from the University of Parma in Italy, I think. It's called The Words as Social Tools Model. And the idea, if I can sum it up from memory, and I like this idea, is that so the acquisition of a socially available public language, just concrete labels, basically function almost as a new perceptual modality. They enable us to concretize abstract relations, and in doing so, create a new domain of perceptually simple objects that we can then target our thinking towards. What the hell do I mean by that? So, for example, if I have a token that represents the relation same or greater than, I can unify a very wide, diverse range of concrete experiences, but also situations, social contexts, under one tag. And thereby, and actually Hume talked about this as well, talked about forming habits of word use. Like he used the example of figure or shape. And he said before we kind of fix what we mean by that general term, we revolve in our minds all different figures of squares and parallelograms, but under that one term. So we develop a habit for using that word. So my idea that I'm actually writing a paper on this now is that it's actually dealing with Frege, Frege's third realm. But in terms of using words as tools, as concrete objects, which enable us to concretize abstract relations. And then we have this social element. So not only are we requiring the actual word ostensibly, like pointing to red, but in the actual use. So our simulations won't track just the brute token, but also its use in context.
Right. So yeah, I guess I'm not really familiar with this idea of using labels to concretize abstract or something. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I'm not quite getting what the gist of the proposal is.
Okay, so a great paper, I think it's called Language Naive Chimpanzees by Odin. So what he did is he tried to get a group of chimpanzees, one language trained, one language naive, and another that had just learned to associate tokens with relations, to do sorting tasks, first order and higher order. So basically, so the chimpanzees were taught to associate a actual physical yellow triangle with the relationship same. So for example, two cups, two identical shoes,
Mm-hmm.
and then so they were trained to recognize this relation. But then even after they weren't actually presented the physical tokens, those and only those chimps who had experience with these way tag for concretizing these relations were able to, in the absence of those symbols, recognize the relations and to sort. But the surprising thing was they could even do higher order relations. So basically, if you have, say, two sets, a cup and a shoe, and then another one of two different items, they could recognize that as an instance of higher order difference. Same
Mm-hmm.
thing, you have two shoes and then two cups, they could associate that token of, or so here it goes. But so the idea is that
Yeah, there's similar research with humans that's been done recently, and I'm more familiar with that than with the chimp stuff. But anyway, yeah, go ahead, continue then.
so the idea is that the actual materiality, physical tokens of public language, in conjunction with the habits, enable us to unify a bunch of diverse experiences. So, for example, like Borges uses example of like freedom. Like, we hear that word in context of being taught it, but we also might think of, being let out of prison and all these things, these different associations, but the word itself being more similar than any two instances of freedom, it
Mm-hmm.
grounds that. And the neuroscience of that is something I believe Antonio Damasio called convergence zones, where this kind of abstract, not abstract, this the actual tag of a word uh, acts kind of as the binding for all these diverse neural correlates of different experiences. So you take all this embodied concrete relations and bind a whole family of things together under one tag.
Okay, so the idea here is that you've got an abstract term, right? And the way you come to ground its meaning is that you basically look at all the instances in its extension or something like that?
That's too formal. It's more like just having some kind of tag. Let's try to make it dumber. I think it needs to be. And so by having one label to conjoin a vast array of different things, essentially, or something. So let's take it back to the chimpanzee. Something like simply like the same, an abstract relation like the same, and associate it with a yellow triangle. Then what the actual objects that constitute that relation don't matter anymore. It's just recognizing that relationship and signifying it with a particular tag. So that, at its most basic, is, and this is the words as social tools model, is just by learning to concretize abstract relations with an actual tag. For us, public language, for chimps, triangles and circles. But so if I had to put my money somewhere, this is the account of abstract ideas I think has the most promise. And I don't know that I'm doing it justice, but
okay. Well, so one thing I'd say about that is that it's clear that people can engage in abstract reasoning, right? And possibly non-human animals can engage in similar forms of abstract reasoning, at least to a certain extent. So they probably have access to some kind of abstract concepts. And we have data on this, right?
Mm-hmm.
It shows that they can do it, but and maybe they do it somehow by taking into account all these instances that they put under the heading of one particular label or whatever. But how does that sort of vindicate the embodied simulation approach? I mean, why couldn't I, say, look, I buy into sort of a amodal abstract symbol system approach or something like that, of somebody like Fodor, and that can account for the fact that we have abstract reasoning skills that can account for the data that we see, and you can tell a sort of similar story about why or how we can maybe come to have abstract ideas through looking at all the particular instances or generalizing over them or something like that. So how is this sort of tale unique to the sort of embodied simulation hypothesis approach or the human approach or whatever that would separate it from, say, what somebody like Fodor would want to say?
Okay. First I want to say that as far as we know, only the chimps that were actually trained with these tokens were able to deal with these abstract relations. So I don't know that other animals besides ourselves, that in the absence of such tokens, can engage in abstract relation.
No, I totally agree with you there. Maybe we definitely need some kind of labels or language or something to bootstrap our way into having abstract concepts. But why does that come down in favor of the embodied simulation approach or embodied cognition approach over a non-embodied approach, like a Fodorian approach?
Yeah. No, I'd be happy to talk about that. Well, first of all, so, oh God, where to start on this? Obviously, as philosophers and scientists, we should consider competing explanations of phenomenon. I mean, we all struggle with this underdetermination of theory by evidence problem. So if two different things can explain the same phenomenon, that's good to know. The issue is that okay, so we have two different ways of explaining a phenomenon, and to me, the big issue is what makes us want to select one over the other. And I think where the embodied approaches and perceptual symbols win out. First of all, amodal symbols are just too damn powerful. They can explain anything post hoc. I don't know that we get a lot of insight by positing that. Also,
Okay, so the amodal symbol system, you think, it lacks a virtue that maybe the embodied approach has, and maybe
yeah,
you could cash this out in like Popperian terms and
yes.
by saying, look, it's more falsifiable or something like that.
Yeah, and it's also not only falsifiability, but I would also say it's more parsimonious and is a better guide to discovery.
Hmm.
I think, just from terms of evolutionary plausibility, it's more likely that our brains, instead of sprouting a new language module, kind of just repurposed our systems for perception and action and emotion to understand language also, and maybe the coevolution of this publicly available system of representation, spoken and written language, which has been a cultural development over our entire history, has gotten better. Obviously, have you ever tried to do long division with Roman numerals and seen how awkward it is? Obviously things are improving that way. But yeah,
Sure.
so I would say when it comes down to selecting between theories, that the embodied approach wins on those accounts, or at least I don't know, wins. Okay, that's too strong, but I think that's something in its favor. There's also other things. So like I think the amodal approach, Barsala would say, fails to make a priori predictions, and as philosophers of science, I think we would favor something that could make predictions over something that doesn't. It's more falsifiable. So, for example, there's a distance and orientation effects that are predicted by a perceptual account that aren't by an amodal account.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I think that's in its favor. So I think there are good reasons. Oh, here's the big thing. The
Okay.
other thing is why do we postulate amodal symbols at all? I think the chief answer is that during the first half of the last century we developed these amazing formalisms of first order logic and computational theory and Turing machines, and to me it was like, yeah, let's look for our keys where the lights are on. This is like this great explanatory formalism, and I think that's the main reason why we even went there in the first place. And so for me it's like it's kind of doing an extra bit of work to posit this computational formalism in our head where there's not really an evidence for it, I don't think. But also just it's then there's other workarounds, but they seem ad hoc, like saying, well, maybe our perceptual states are transduced into amodal symbols, and then, but
Hmm. That's an
you know,
extra step in the process, and so not as simple to you, right? Is that
yeah. So, but basically, those are the ideas. But obviously, hey man, if our brain is a computer, I want to know about it. If that's the truth, okay, I'll
Mhm.
but give me some. I need more than just that.
Right, right. Yeah, so this is really interesting because this is part of what I work on, the empirical virtues and super empirical virtues of embodied cognition versus competitor theories.
Yeah.
Uh, so to a certain extent, I'm in agreement with you there. I think that the embodied cognitive view definitely has a few virtues
Yeah.
on its side that um, perhaps the disembodied view does not. So, okay, good, good. Well, how long have we been going now? Has it
Uh,
been?
40 minutes or so. So I think we're getting pretty close. But I like talking to you, so I'd be happy to
Yeah, yeah. No, this is
answer.
great.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of stuff. I'm not quite sure what else I wanted to talk about. Let me pull up my commentary here. Um, hmm. Oh yeah, there was we talked earlier a couple of weeks ago about some neuroscientific data.
Yeah.
And I had sent you a paper, a Karamazov paper, because so here's one argument that you could you could possibly make for the disembodied or for the embodied view, right? The embodied simulation hypothesis. You could say actually it's a little more consistent with the neuroimaging data that we've collected. You know, when people hear a word or something like that, it activates areas of their brain in, you know, motor cortex, in visual cortex or whatever. Now, doesn't this show that the embodied simulation hypothesis is true? It seems like people are accessing these motor perceptual areas when they're bringing forth a particular concept, right? So doesn't that show that these concepts are grounded in, you know, motor knowledge, perceptual knowledge, that kind of thing? And you know, recently a paper came out that says actually, you know, we can't say that the embodied view actually, you know, predicts these types of activation patterns that we see. The disembodied view can accommodate that fact just as well, that these areas light up when we, you know, tell people to, you know, speak, or when we let them hear particular words like hammer or whatever. It's just that you know, when people hear those words, there's activation spread through the network. There are associations with the meanings of certain words, and that's why those areas get activated. So, you know, the embodied simulation hypothesis doesn't really have the data on its side. At best, it's consistent with the data that's available, but that data doesn't actually favor or strongly favor the embodied simulation hypothesis over a more disembodied approach. So back, you know,
Yeah.
putting this back in the context of the conversation we've been having. Look, one virtue, you know, you could say that an embodied approach has over its disembodied competitor is that it's got this data on its side, right? Or it's able to make predictions that the disembodied approach cannot, or it's able to make true predictions, right? But you know, a lot of this data has been called into question recently. So,
well, no,
did you have a chance to look at them?
I did. I read the paper, and I mean, a lot of my responses we just talked about issues of parsimony and just also the fact that sure, amodal symbols or disembodied can explain anything. Though the curious thing is, I would say at the end of the paper, the guy that wrote that paper actually says that his work does falsify a certain version of disembodied, the disembodied view. If I can remember what he called it. The idea that if there's no crosstalk between different systems, so his idea is that, okay, well, at least this kind of does show that there's at least crosstalk between some amodal conception and the actual perceptual system. So to me, that smells funny. But what really I kind of like is,
you think so?
Yeah. Well, and then at the end, he actually endorses a view he calls, what does he call it? Grounding via interaction, which actually sounds a lot like the words of social tool model, but with a kind of a mediating amodal representation. And for me, I'm like, why skip that? I say just skip the transduction and go straight to actual public language as the glue. We don't need to transduce into anything. We have actual representations of words as physical tokens, by which I mean, you know, noises we hear or marks on paper we read, which suffice to play the role of the amodal symbols. They are amodal symbols that are arbitrarily linked to their references. But then you take that, and I will run with, I forget his name, who wrote the paper, but with this grounding via interaction, just, yeah. So I think, I don't know, like I said, it's good to consider alternate views, but I think, and like I said, you know, amodal symbols can explain just about anything you want them to. So.
Right.
But also, there's other things like, so it's not just the sensory, you know, the lighting up of the fMRI of the motor system when you're understanding language that provide. It's not the only evidence for embodied simulation. There's the Perky effect, interference effects, Glenberg's action-sentence compatibility effects, then the predicted, Barsalou mentions the distance and orientation effects. So there's a lot more than that. Ooh, my favorite one is a very recent paper by Glenberg, where he studied the ability to interpret emotional language with people who just got Botox injections, and there was very significant delays in people who couldn't make the relevant facial expressions. There's significant delays in their ability to comprehend emotional language. So I think, if it was just that evidence, it might be like interesting, or maybe might clue you in. But I think there's more evidence, and hopefully more will come in. Hopefully I'll be part of making some of it.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, the Botox thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm sort of skeptical about that, because I mean, why would paralyzing your face prevent you from understanding emotional language? I mean, it's not as if when you see somebody in, or when you hear someone talking about pain or something, you then make the facial expression, like, oh, I'm in pain, or what, you know what I mean? Like,
No,
it might activate motor areas, but they're like offline. They're not like sending like a efferent motor copy to make your face contort in a certain way, or whatever. So
the research I've just looked at says exactly that. Basically, is
really?
Yeah, is that we actually
Wow.
social contagion. So we actually are able to literally feel the pain of other people, like not metaphorically. So this guy got Lieberman, so from Harvard, is doing. It's actually my next thing I'm working on, is dealing with the social side of linguistic normativity. And what he showed is that the same parts of the brain that are used for physical pain register social pain.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, his contention is that we actually hurt in feeling, first of all, like social neglect, but also just like when we see other people in pain.
Yeah.
But the idea is that actually, and they've done actual research filming people's faces watching other people, like stick their hand in a car door or get hit by a car, and actually, will make similar mirroring faces. This is what wakes me up in the middle of the night with excitement. Is I just found out that where most of the human mirror neurons are located. Do you know this?
No, I thought it was funny. It wakes you up in the middle of the night with excitement.
Yeah, so I just very recently figured out, and I hope this is true, is that the human mirror neurons are concentrated in Broca's area. And that's exciting because that's the language. That's part of it's very responsible for language. So this idea of like linguistic normativity, this idea of convention, and this our disposition to use language that matches our community might have something to do with the mirror neuron system. So yeah, the idea is that we actually do, not only unconsciously, but kind of are compelled to resonate with other people in expressions of pain and emotion. But yeah, there's a lot of research going back to Darwin about facial expressions and emotions. So.
Yeah. I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of the facial expression research. Had to read a lot of that for cognitive science courses and stuff. But I mean, this idea that paralyzing your face would somehow prevent you from registering emotional language as well just seems strange, and it seems dangerous to me to make that claim, because in the early days of the embodied cognition literature, when people were first starting to say, like, look, this is something interesting, here, this sort of gives us insight into the way that people think and understand the language. When you look at that literature, a lot of people's first reaction was to say, like, oh, well, your concepts are based on, like, your motor abilities, or, well, what if you're paralyzed, right? Like, what if you can't walk? Does that mean you don't have the concept of walking anymore? Or something. It was a completely, like, straw manning of the argument or something, but it's like, it's really strange to hear that Bloomberg is saying something like, well, yeah, if you paralyze your face, like, oh, yeah, then you're not going to be able to understand emotional language as well. I mean, well, I think it's kind of, like, very dangerous.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm probably grossly misrepresenting his work, but the idea is that it would inhibit your understanding. So it just creates delays. But I would look at the paper. But no, you're totally right though about just like this danger of stating too strong a thesis. And this is where I really like Dr. Shapiro's work, is I feel like he's kind of cleaning up the shed a bit with these kind of sketchy versions of embodied cognition, and his works influenced me a lot into being like, okay, this is an exciting new way of looking at cognitive science for all of those who are tired of the computational framework. But let's not get too excited. We need to be careful, and
sure.
we don't want to set up houses of cards that and I feel like that's what happened with the imagistic theory of mind and meaning, like going back to Hume and even Epicurus, that it just became this target of mass mockery in the days of logical positivism. And even back to J.S. Mill, they'd say, like, when I ask my servant to fetch me a glass of wine, I'm not asking him for an idea of wine, or like and this is the common, like, Quine would say, nobody confuses the Parthenon with the Parthenon idea, or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So and it's easy, like these intuition pumps can easily knock down fruitful lines of inquiry, but then we can be just as guilty setting these house of cards up for other people to knock over. We have to be careful. So yeah, I think it's some measured skepticism is always healthy, and it keeps you from looking like an ass too.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that for me, like, I don't. So like what I'm working on now is that not that concepts are kind of determined by the body, but conceptualizations. The way we actually grasp concepts is dependent upon our embodied experience and perceiving affordances or whatnot. But still, two people can have the same concept but conceptualize it entirely differently. And Shapiro makes a good argument against, Lakoff and Johnson's spherical being, who couldn't grasp the concept of front. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
Yeah, front or up and down or whatever. They live in a zero-G environment, and they're completely round, and so they just float around, and, how could they ever come to have the concept of up, down, or...
Yeah, and the answer is they could. They could be the direction things approach from, or any number of ways, and it would still be, in my view, and I think Shapiro's view, at least according to his book, they could attain the concept. They just, what I would say is they access it through a different mode of presentation. I would say, like, if you think of a concept like as a Freudian sense or something, and think of like the way you access it as a certain mode of presentation, be it bodied or social.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we've talked, I think, over an hour now.
Oh, God.
I think.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, man. I really like enjoying talking to you. It's cool to meet somebody who's into some of the same world,
Yeah, definitely. And I've gotten something out of the conversation. I'm going to go take a look at that Glenberg paper.
Nice. I think you can access it through his lab at U of Arizona. He has a link to all his papers.
Awesome. Yeah. I'll take a look at that. Botox and is that what's the paper called? It's got to have a funny name, right?
Oh, God. I don't remember, but it's like inhibition of emotional comprehension with Botox or something like that. It's been a while since I read. But yeah, great talking to you, Jonathan. And so send me a link to when this goes up. I'd love to check it out. And
oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, maybe I'll see you at a conference or something. I'd love to meet you in person at some point.
Yeah, definitely, of course. It was nice talking to you, man. I enjoyed reading your paper.
Thanks a lot, man. Take care.
All right, see ya. Bye.